Today I'm gonna talk about a special kind of multiple regression called hierarchical multiple regression. Um, so there will be two parts to this tutorial. First, I will briefly talk about hierarchical multiple regression and when this particular analysis is used, under what situations can it be used, and then secondly, we will demonstrate how to run hierarchical multiple regression in JASP. Okay, so let's say for example you have a theory here, and this theory is about self-efficacy and the predictors or the sources of self-efficacy. So according to Bandura, self-efficacy can be sourced from mastery experience, vicarious experience, social persuasion, and physiological arousal. Now, what if you want to test this particular theory? So what we can do is to collect data that measures these variables and to use multiple regression to determine the collective whether or not self-efficacy can be collectively accounted for by the predictor variables, and likewise what are the individual contributions of these four predictors to our outcome variable, which is self-efficacy. However, what if in your literature you also learned that self-efficacy varies across gender? So let's say for example, so you there is consistent literature that gender seems to contribute also to the variation in self-efficacy. um, so what we want to do, and if we don't account for gender, um, the results in the analysis, when we look into uh, uh, whether or not these predictors can influence self-efficacy, does not take into account gender. um, and gender might play, let's say for example, some form of a third uh, third variable uh, that can also influence self-efficacy. So what I'm saying is that, what if we want to know whether these four predictors account for the variation in self-efficacy, um, on top of how much gender explains the variation in self-efficacy. Another way of saying this is that, um, will these four predictors influence self-efficacy, assuming that you know the gender of the participants are the same, um, excluding, hence excluding that particular factor, which is gender. So in such case, so gender essentially is a covariate, no? And typically covariates can contaminate the results. So what we want to do for covariates is that we want to control them. And in multiple regression, one way to control covariates is by including them in the model. And with that, we can run a hierarchical multiple regression. It is called hierarchical multiple regression because the analysis is done in hierarchies. So in this particular example, we will first run a regression with this as a predictor variable. And so that's the first of the hierarchy. And then on step 2, we will include these four as predictors. So essentially in step 1, you only have your control variable, and in step 2, you include your second block of predictors, um, So for step 2, you will have all of these variables. So that conceptually is what we meant to say by hierarchical regression. By doing so, we will be able to um, compute for how much these account for self-efficacy, or how much of self-efficacy rather is accounted by these four outside what is explained by gender. So that's one scenario wherein hierarchical multiple regression is used when you have um, a control variable that you want to control for, and you want to examine the contribution of the predictors to the outcome outside uh, what the other uh, control variable can explain. So that's one scenario. Another scenario is this. Sometimes we have a well-established theory, such as the theory of the sources of self-efficacy, but if your research is about what if you want to expand the theory, and you are saying that aside from these predictors, you are hypothesizing based on the literature that you have read that there might be another potential predictor, and that is invitations. In literature, invitation is defined as sending out message of positivity, of encouragement to oneself and to others. So if you are the kind of person who tells other people you can do it, then you are sending out invitations. If you are the kind of person to tell yourself that you can do it, you can become successful, then you are sending out invitations. And literature points out that this might be a fifth predictor to self-efficacy, which is a novel contribution or addition to the existing predictors. And so what you want to do is, or your question is, can this still contribute, or can this additional variable still explain some more or additional variance in self-efficacy on top of what is already explained by the four existing predictors? Then you can also use hierarchical multiple regression. So again, similar to the first example, this will be your step 1. This is step 1 of your hierarchy. And then for step 2 of your hierarchy, you now include invitations together with your first block of variables. So those are two possible, or those are two examples of situations wherein um, hierarchical multiple regression might be considered. No? So again, one, if you are testing a model, but you want to test the model on top of or controlling for a variable. And second, when you are testing uh, something new that might be considered as an inclusion to an already well-established theory. So those are two possible situations wherein you might use um, hierarchical regression. Um, okay, so let us now um, let us now try to do a demonstration using JASP, although not exactly with these same examples or variables. Okay, so as a demonstration of how to run hierarchical multiple regression in JASP, so we have this data set. We will not use all of these variables. So let me give a background of this data set. Our outcome variable here is voice. When we talk about voice, this is a behavior that people engage in when they are confronted with a problematic romantic relationship. Specifically, voice is a set of behaviors um, that can be described as active and constructive. So if you are in a disappointing relationship and you are actively engaging with your partner in order to resolve your problems, if you are talking to him or her, trying to find ways to compromise, then you are engaging in voice. And theoretically, people who engage in voice are those who have more investments in the relationships, and thus these are some of our investments. For this particular example, I've picked three. So one is history of forgiveness. So forgiving your partner for a previous transgression can be regarded as an investment. Shared assets. So sharing assets, having common property, is also a form of investment. And sharing recreations, so having shared leisurely activities can also be considered as investments. And then for this particular example, we have here uh, two control variables. Let's say, for example, that there have been um, it has been consistent in the literature that people who engage in voice also systematically vary in terms of age, and also it also varies in terms of gender. No, there is available literature, and we want to understand the contribution of these three uh, forms of investment outside the contribution of age and gender. So, in that sense, we want to control age and gender, and thus we also enter them in our analysis as control variables, and thus we will use hierarchical multiple regression. So to run a hierarchical multiple regression, let's click on regression, and then linear regression. Of course, this analysis is done under the assumption that you have already run your preliminary Pearson R correlation and that you have made your correlation matrix already. All right, so let us enter our dependent variable. Our dependent variable is voice, and our covariates are, well, these three, based on our model, but we also want to include our control variables. So let's also enter age, gender, and then forgiveness, assets, and recreations, which are our three forms of investment. Now we will exclude duration of the relationship for the meantime. So we already have our output here, and our output here, if you notice, is a simple multiple regression, um, output. For the model summary, it seems that 13.4%, or if you base it on the adjusted R squared, 11.5% of the variation in voice behavior can be explained by all of our variables, and among our variables, some of them seem to positively contribute, or seem to predict rather, um, um, our outcome variable, which is voice. But what we are interested really is not in all of them. What we're only interested is in these three. Um, so when you look at this variance explained, part of this is variance caused by age and gender, which is our control variables, and part of this would be because of our uh, three predictors, based on our the conceptual model. So how do I know how much variance can be explained by these three outside age and gender. That's where hierarchical regression comes in. So to convert this into a hierarchical regression output, let's click on model. And all you have to do is to identify which are your control variables, or essentially which are the variables in your step 1 of your hierarchical multiple regression, by selecting which are those control variables. So let us check on age and gender, which are our control variables. And the first thing that you'll notice is that our outputs doubled. So instead of just having one set of r squared, adjusted r squared, we have two. One is for model 0. Model 0 is basically age and gender as predictors. And model 1 is age, gender, forgiveness, assets, and recreations. Okay, so again, model 0 on all of these results pertain to age and gender, and model 1 and all of its results pertain to age, gender, forgiveness, assets, and recreations. Okay, so in model 0, we can see here that age and gender explain 3.6 of the variance in um, self-efficacy. Okay, is this significant? We can look at our ANOVA table, and yes, it is significant. It is small, yes, but it is significant. And in here, we can look at the individual contributions. It seems that it's only age really that is um, predicting um, predicting self sorry, not self-efficacy, predicting voice, and it's actually negatively predicting voice. So it seems that people who are younger are the ones who engage more in voice compared to people who are older. There is no variation, however, in terms of gender. And then for model 1, model 1 is all of the variables. It is now explaining 13.4%. Um, but but how do we isolate the variance explained by forgiveness, assets, and recreations? Because 3.6 is what age and gender explains. 13.4 is what age, gender, forgiveness, assets, and recreations explain. But what does forgiveness, assets, and recreations only explain? How much variance? So to get to that, we are looking for what we call as the R change, or the R squared change. So the R squared change basically is the change from 0.03 to zero point 0.1 or 0.134. So it's basically the difference between these two R squares. And to get that, let's click on statistics and let's choose R squared change. And here we go. So the change from 0.36 to 0.3134 is this. And what is it? 0.097. So that's the difference. And this, if you convert this into percentage, 9.7 is the variance, again, 9.7% of the variance in voice that is explained by forgiveness, assets, and recreation. Okay, so this is the amount of variability in your outcome variable that is accounted for by your three predictors outside your control variables, or on top of your control variables. So I hope that is clear. Now the next question is this a significant variance? And to answer that, we have an F statistic here, which tells us whether this is significantly different from zero. And the answer is yes, it is. So these three are significantly predicting um, 9.7% of the variance in voice behavior. And then we can look at our individual predictors. I will no longer talk specifically about what the unstandardized and standardized coefficients are. If you are still interested in that, you can take a look at my previous videos on multiple regression. So if we look here, it seems that forgiveness positively predicts voice, meaning to say the more history of forgiveness is in the past, the more they likely are to engage in voice. That makes sense. And also recreations is also a positive predictor, meaning to say uh, the more they share recreations, the more they are likely to engage in voice. Surprisingly, assets or having common assets doesn't seem to have any contribution to the engagement of voice. All right, so that's it on how to run uh, multiple or hierarchical multiple regression. So if you have any questions, please comment down below and I'll try to answer uh, as much as I can. Thank you.